Hey guys, we are going to start chapter 11. We've got 6 more days of e-learning, including today. Doing e-learning, we have bypassed a whole lot of projects. We probably have bypassed 4 projects that we would have done in class. We won't get to watch Hoosiers, the movie, but that's okay. We're going to move on to chapter 11. The beginning of chapter 11 is just a lot of review, so I'm going to go through this part fairly quickly. It goes back and talks about our 1816 Constitution, and in it, we're like, hey, all men are born equally free, but we're still going to put a whole lot of regulations on African Americans. So we're going to tell them that you can't vote, you can't testify in court, and we're going to prohibit mixed marriages until 1965. I thought that was a crazy date. And we've always struggled with people who are different than the definition of a Hoosier, right? So Hoosiers back in the day were just white. And so anybody different, we struggled with. And as time went on, we struggled with equality, the equality of women, the equality of Blacks, Hispanics, immigrants, right? And we talked about old and new immigrants and which ones we liked better. We liked the old better because they could be taught to be white. But just going through this timeline, 1851, we're still against slavery. But we're going to close our borders off, right? And so they can't get in. 14th Amendment, good things are happening for the African American because now citizenship has been defined and they are guaranteed equal protection in the eyes of the law, right? And so then you've got the 15th Amendment. These are basically the Civil War amendments, which allowed all men, Black or white, can now vote. So big woot there, but then you enter into the whole phase of the grandfather clause and, poll taxes and literacy tests to prevent the Blacks from being able to vote, unfortunately. Then we got into a little bit later, Plessy versus Ferguson, the guy who wouldn't get off the train car. Remember, he only had 1 drop of Black blood in him. And the Supreme Court said, okay, now everything is separate but equal. We are officially, the United States is now officially allowed to segregate. And that's going to hold true until about 1954 with the passage of Brown versus Board of Education. So segregation is going to be illegal for quite some time. I thought this was interesting. This was an amusement park in Indy, and they're all pointing to patronage whites only solicited. So here you've got an amusement park. It's only going to serve white people in 1962. 1920, you can see this is like the timeline for freedoms. Women can now vote due to the passage of the 19th Amendment. That was huge. This I thought was interesting. In 1927, there was a subdivision in Bloomington, and they restricted who could live in this neighborhood, this new neighborhood. And it said, the ownership and occupancy of lots or buildings in the subdivision are forever restricted to members of the pure white race. World War I, World War II, African Americans are allowed to fight, but they're in segregated units. And, on the battlefield, they were pretty much equal. But when they came home, they were treated like second-class citizens. And the African Americans really struggled with that. And after World War II, it basically helped lead to the civil rights era. Makes total sense. If you vote, if you can fight for us on the battlefield, you probably have rights when you come home. Here you got women voting. The thing about women, though, is that once they got married, they were expected to work at home. You really weren't allowed socially to work outside the home. And of course, your options for professions were very limited: teacher, nurse, secretary. And that's in the 1950s. And then, of course, in the 1970s, there's going to be a revitalization for women's rights. But we don't get too much into that in Indiana. Okay, so there's pretty much your overview of freedoms and how they were obtained. Okay. So really, I think we can say that Indiana was a very racist state, generally speaking. Okay. Now, I'm not speaking for everybody, but generally speaking, that was Indiana. Okay. I mean, seriously, backbone of the KKK, right? All right. So let's get into Robert Kennedy. He actually had a lot of history in Indiana. So I thought it was very interesting, especially with his quote. And of course, this is JFK's brother. Um, I'm telling you, I've told you before, Indiana used to be on the map. We used to be really important. And so Robert Kennedy said Indiana is a terribly important state. If we can win in Indiana, we can win in every other state and win when we go to convention in August. Boom, Indiana was it, right? Nowadays, it's what state is it? It's like, oh, if we can win Ohio, we're going to win, right? Um, but at the same time, we're skeptical, we're hard to move, and you got to show me kind of attitude. Prove it to me. Just prove it to me. Um, Robert Kennedy was a man that fought for both races, and he fought for the poor whites. He fought for the poor African Americans, the disadvantaged in both races. Okay, and that is going to be a hard sell for Hoosiers because didn't Hoosiers didn't put the races on the same playing field, but Robert Kennedy did. Okay, April 4th. If I can win here in Indiana, I could go on to win the Democratic presidential nomination and turn this country around with your help. And so now he's speaking in South Bend. And, speaking at Notre Dame was brilliant because the Kennedy family was Catholic. So to go to a Catholic university, super smart, right? And so he starts traveling back down to Delaware County because he's going to fly out of our airport and fly down to Indianapolis. And en route, he receives word that Martin Luther King is assassinated. And here he is heading to Indy. Okay. Now, what he did was amazing. I would love for you to read through this speech. I'm not going to sit here and read it for you, but his speech was amazing because he gets to Indy after speaking at Notre Dame, and he knows he's going to face a crowd of enraged people. I'd be shaking in my boots, right? And he presented a speech that was so calming to these people that were listening in this crowd that our city was the only city that did not have a riot in it. I thought that was kind of cool. I was like trying to figure out how to put that. But yeah, our city did not have a riot because of Robert Kennedy's words. And there were riots in Washington, D.C., Chicago, Baltimore, but our streets were quiet. It says this lady who remembered it, Mary Evans, remembered feeling as if Kennedy had laid his hands upon the audience and healed them, deflating the anger that coursed through the packed throng. So his words promoted and gave people that peace that they needed to hear. If you're ever in downtown Indy, here is the place that he gave this speech. And it's got Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy reaching out to each other to promote racial harmony. They both had that shared dream of racial harmony. So this is Martin Luther King Jr. Park at 17th and Broadway, north of downtown Indy. So I thought that was pretty cool. You can actually listen to his speech also on YouTube. It's a pretty powerful speech. So, So he did what he needed to do because he really wants the Democratic nomination, right? And so he connected with Hoosiers. There was some fellow from Massachusetts that was here the other day that called it Indiana. It was my younger brother, Teddy. He looks like me, but I call it Indiana. And we're going to elect a president of the United States that knows how to pronounce the name of this state. I've never heard it pronounced Indiana. But a few days later, a few days before May 68, Robert Kennedy made a campaign stop in Indy after his speech in response to Martin Luther King's assassination. So he came back to Indiana. When he came back to Indiana, he really connected. He was talking about Abraham Lincoln. He was talking about James Whitcomb Riley, right, the artist. And visited George Rogers Clark Memorial, William Harrison's home in Vincennes. So he knew how to connect with Hoosiers. He came across as authentic, direct, and straightforward, a person in whom people could have confidence. And that's what I think brought Indiana around. And he ended up winning the state of Indiana. So 56 to 63 state delegates. So that was pushing him closer to the Democratic nomination. Unfortunately, he did end up getting assassinated 2 months after Martin Luther King. So he never got to run in the general election, but I bet you he would have won. And then Richard Nixon will be the next president, and he will be a Republican. Robert Kennedy was a Democrat. So, all right. So that's the beginning of chapter 11. All right, I am filming this on a Friday, so I'm going to tell you, hey, I hope you have a good weekend, even though that might not make sense when you watch it. All right, I hope you guys are doing well.